Big Country Politics on KTAB continues.
Well, hello and welcome to this week's Sunday Conversation here on Big Country Politics. I am Manny Diaz. This week we are joined by Mr. Scott Beard, founder of Project Destiny and pastor at FountainGate Fellowship Church here in Abilene. Scott, first and foremost, it's great to have a chat with you. Always enjoy speaking with you.
Well, I appreciate you, Manny. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. And just right out of the gate, I'd like to say a couple things. First of all, I want to thank all of the supporters, 3,100 votes, which was no small thing, that believed in me and voted for me. And then at the same time, man, I want to apologize, really, and even at some level repent for some of the unforced errors and some of the rookie mistakes we made, which may have caused some of my voters, some of those in the community to think less of me in any way. And I apologize for that. We've learned a lot, we've grown a lot, and if I run again, which I may, I'll be a lot smarter. Let me put it that way. So thank you for the grace, and I would pray this. That there would be grace enough to put up with my mistakes. It wouldn't overshadow 31 years of love for our city, faithfulness to my church, and love for the Lord. I love this city, and I would hope that the last few months wouldn't in any way overshadow that. So just wanted to say that.
Well, that's a nice segue. Certainly we're talking about the city of Abilene today, and certainly there was, in last week's city council meeting that sparked, a lot of attention, primarily because of the Sanctuary City for the Unborn ordinance, and in terms of kind of just going over the ordinance itself, perhaps, and just kind of an overall discussion. Right. That's what was on the table there. Really nothing to amend anything at all. Before we get to the whole all the nuts and bolts of that whole thing, give me your thoughts on last week's meeting.
Well, I want to make a statement and be clear on something. We need to understand that while some doctors may have issues with this ordinance and some confusion over it, at the end of the day, even if this ordinance hadn't passed, Manny, there were pre-Roe v. Wade Texas abortion statutes in place. The Texas Heartbeat Act was in place, and the Human Life Protection Act was all in place, which mirrors the same penalties that are in the Sanctuary City Ordinance. And so even if the ordinance hadn't passed, these doctors would be subject to the same kind of litigation that's out there. And so I know the focus is on the ordinance because it's in their backyard, but because they live in Texas, there is that. So I think it's important to understand that and to make clear that that still, had it not even passed, that would still been the case.
Well, you had kind of got up, and you had spoke in the discussion portion of this meeting, and you really aren't for amending this ordinance. You would like to keep it as is, and use the word use the phrase keeping the integrity of it. Explain that.
Well, one of the points I made was obviously I lost on May 6th, lost the election to my opponent, and I have to accept what the voters decided. I had to accept the will of the voter, and in the same way, on November 8th, 2022, the voters decided, 15,000 votes voted that this ordinance be accepted and put in place as is. And so at that point, my point to the city council was this: look, amend means to change. I get that you're not looking to repeal the ordinance, and I appreciate that. It wouldn't be wise to do that, given it was voted into law by 15,000 voters in a democratic process in our city. But to even amend means change, and given that fact, I would be concerned that in the amendments or changing of language, it could affect the integrity of the ordinance. And I made that point. Is it to say that there shouldn't be some effort made to try to maybe clarify some of that language? I'm for that. I shared with you earlier. I think the best way to do that is a roundtable discussion with some of the medical personnel at Hendrick Hospital and maybe some key authors, the key folks that wrote this ordinance. We've already been talking about that on our side, to sit down with them to clarify some of that language. But then here's my suggestion, Manny, is not amend the ordinance, not amend what the voters voted for or change what the voters voted for, but to put forward, the city could put forward an official memo to Hendrick Hospital, having agreed on some clarity and language in regard to some of the medication in question, that kind of thing. I would be more for that and be willing to get behind that. Absolutely.
Well, they were, the council members, they were entertaining the idea of perhaps assembling a subcommittee to perhaps see if any amendments need to take place with that. From your camp, from your side of things, was that something that you would be in favor of, for them to at least have an opportunity to look at that?
Yeah, I think it'd be good. I'm not against that. Again, my position would be, though, to instead put an official statement together from the city council, a memo together, official memo from the city council, having agreed with these two entities, the medical community and the folks that were behind the writing of this ordinance, and then bring the clarity that needs to be brought through that memo versus changing the ordinance. I'm just not for this ordinance. Isn't old enough, Manny. That's not even 7 months old.
Well, it was voted on last November.
It just was voted on, and so I get that there's some confusion, and I think it would be foolish not to be willing to sit down and talk through that. And I appreciated Councilman Beard and Shane Price's advice on that, and I think there's some value to that, to sitting down together and talking through that. But I'd still be, and I think the guys that are behind the writing of this ordinance would be against changing it as well.
Well, from the talks of possibly amending this ordinance to the debate regarding drugs used when it comes to this ordinance, that and more coming up after the break, right here on Big Country Politics.
Big Country Politics on KTAB continues.
Well, welcome back to our Sunday conversation here on Big Country Politics. I am Manny Diaz, this week's guest, founder of Project Destiny, also pastor at FountainGate Fellowship Church here in Abilene, Mr. Scott Beard. Scott, we were talking in the first segment about last week's city council meeting, the discussion regarding the sanctuary city for the unborn ordinance. We talked about the possibility of this being amended. This segment here, let's talk about what's being discussed, because the use of certain drugs that are linked to abortion. Tell me about these drugs and kind of what you know about them so far.
Well, there are two drugs in question. Mifepristone is one, and then misoprostol is the other. Mifepristone is a drug that's used for an elective abortion, to induce an abortion or elective abortion. Effectively, what it does is it cuts off the progesterone production in a woman's body, which then kills the infant. Misoprostol it produces, basically what it does, it induces, like if a woman goes in and she's term and needs to bring the baby forward, then it helps to induce labor, which is a good thing, obviously. 3 girls and 5 kids, 3 girls, and they've all had babies, and there have been times when they've needed to induce labor, and that's that drug used for that. And it's also used with miscarriages. When there's a miscarriage, they'll use that so that the uterus can expel its content at that point. That's a good thing. But if they're used in any way in connection to an elective abortion, then this ordinance makes them illegal. However, it's important to understand that the ordinance only stops the use of these 2 drugs if they're used for an elective abortion. OBGYNs can still prescribe, according to this ordinance, both of these drugs if they need to use them in any other setting that protects, obviously, that protects and would be helpful to the mother and not harmful to the mother. So that's in the ordinance, and I get that maybe there could be some clarity to that, given to that. But that was the big discussion at city council meeting. It primarily circled around those.
Well, there was a woman who was kind of, and without kind of just going into her story, but she was talking about, I believe it was something related to a menstrual cycle and how a certain drug could, like this, could potentially help her with that. In terms of amending, allowing for there be a change or amendment to this regarding, or allowing language for this to be used in this type of ordinance, is that something that y'all would explore? I
think so. I think to make sure they know that if it's used to help the mother, and again, it's there in the ordinance, and maybe where it's not clear enough, let's make it clearer. But if it's used to help the mother, and the example that you gave was compelling, and would absolutely understand why she would be concerned that for some reason her OBGYN or her doctor would not prescribe that to her out of fear of litigation. And so, again, to be clear, if it's helpful to the mother and not used in terms of creating or forcing an elective abortion, then there's room for it in this ordinance. It's allowed.
But you would say this probably needs to be a little bit more clear, perhaps a little bit more clear in the ordinance itself.
If that's where this roundtable, the subcommittee could sit down together and hammer out clarity on that and maybe bring some clarity to that, yeah, I agree.
Okay.
I'll go back to, again, I don't think that it would be wise to reword the ordinance itself, but to put forward some kind of a official statement or memo.
Speaking of that, Councilman Kyle McAllister really, touched on this and kind of went after the ordinance. I wouldn't say went after, but he kind of just, put some words to it, saying that it was vague.
Yeah.
And things really need to be addressed. And I think it's not only that, but in terms of, what you would say to that. Do you feel that this ordinance is vague itself?
I don't. One of the things that was given to the City Council was a very well-written document by Mark Lee Dixon, one of the authors of the ordinance. And he explains and goes down the line of explaining some of the concerns that the council have and that some of the medical personnel have at Henry. I would suggest to Kyle, read that thoroughly, check its sources, do your homework, and I think if you're open-minded, you'll see that it's not as vague as you're saying it is. I think there's a little bit of fear-mongering, I think, that could be going on, a little bit of gaslighting. You get the impression almost that all of Hendrick is in turmoil over this and all of Abilene's in turmoil over this. And for those that are in turmoil over it, they're in turmoil, and my heart goes out to them, and certainly. But it's not to minimize that. But it is to say this thing isn't old enough the ordinance isn't old enough to cause the level of confusion that is kind of inferred by something like what happened at the City Council meeting on Thursday.
Well, there was also, discussion that was brought up that this could, discourage companies or discourage even our military base with the use of this ordinance, with the language in it.
Yeah.
Do you feel that could discourage potential, enterprises or companies to come to Abilene because of this particular ordinance?
It might some, I don't know, but in terms of making a statement as inflammatory as it affecting the military base, I think that's what I'm talking about in terms of kind of some fear-mongering, some gaslighting that just shouldn't be said. Because, look, there are those with strong opinions that are going to make their points, and I get it. I have strong opinions, and I try to make my points. But could it affect some businesses? It might. I don't think it will. I think Abilene's on a great track in terms of growth and where we're going and this industry coming. I don't think this ordinance is going to keep businesses from coming. I know one of the things that Manny often said is that in regard to it restricting insurances from covering what they call abortion care, which is an oxymoron. And the truth is, that's been state law since 2017, that no insurance company in this state can cover abortion services. They just can't. It's against the law. So they'll point at this ordinance and blame the ordinance for that. A lot of what's said in this ordinance, Manny, you need to understand, and folks need to understand, it's just declaring what's already out there. It's just saying these things are already in place. The ordinance is getting picked on because it's in Abilene's backyard and by folks in Abilene that don't like the ordinance. But all it's doing is reiterating, by and large, what's already out there.
Well, Scott, appreciate your time, sir.
Absolutely. Thank you again. Appreciate you, Manny.
Well, for Scott Beard, pastor at FountainGate Fellowship Church and founder of Project Destiny here in Abilene, I'm Manny Diaz. This has been another Sunday conversation right here on Big Country Politics. We'll see you next week.